was in middle school, my parents let me walk home from school because we lived really close by. They would of course give me a ride if it was raining or freezing out, but for the majority of the year, I would follow the same short path home each day without incident. One fall day, I was walking out of school and passing the rows of buses waiting to pick up kids. Then I passed the carpool line with parents waiting for the kids to come out to the car. Most kids either walked to school or rode the bus, so the carpool line was always pretty short. In fact, I knew which cars belonged to which families and would always wave to the parents as I walked by. It was a small town, and everyone tended to know everyone else. That day, I remember seeing a car I didn't recognize in the carpool line. It was black with windows that were so tinted I couldn't tell who was driving. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. I shrugged it off, assuming maybe it was just a family member from out of town that was picking someone up. I continued walking and eventually made it off school property and onto the paved path that led to my neighborhood. There weren't many cars around that day and things were pretty quiet. I looked ahead and noticed that there was a black car parked a short distance ahead of me, right along the path. It looked a lot like the car I had seen in the carpool line, but I couldn't be sure. I remember thinking it was weird because it would be blocking traffic if a car came down the street. For some reason, I felt a little bit uncomfortable and even considered crossing to the other side of the street. But the path I was on was the most efficient, and I wanted to get home as fast as possible. When I approached the car, I looked straight ahead and pretended not to notice it, quickening my pace. But just as I was passing the vehicle, I could hear the window roll down and a man's voice call out to me. I turned to look and it was an older man who I didn't recognize. He had a black hat on and a black trench coat. Something about him made me feel even more uneasy. He told me that his name was Phil and that something had happened to my dad. He said that my mom had asked him to go pick me up from school and take me to the hospital, and that's why he was waiting in the carpool line. I immediately knew that something was off. If anything had happened to my dad, I knew my mom would never send someone I had never met to pick me up. I had plenty of other family members that they would call first. I told the man that I thought he had the wrong person and began to walk away, but he persisted, telling me that he was sure I was the girl he was looking for. At this point, I was really creeped out, so I just began to walk away, heading towards my house at a quick pace. I heard a door open behind me and looked back to see that the man was running after me. I began sprinting as fast as I could towards my house, but the man was catching up quickly and I needed to throw him off. There was a wooded area leading up to my house and I decided to run through it in hopes that the trees would hide me. When I reached my house, I looked around but saw no sight of the man. I went inside, locking the doors behind me. I told my parents about him and they filed a police report, but it has been years now, and they never found him. When I got my driver's license and my first car, I would always get gas at a gas station just across the street from my neighborhood. One day after school, I got in my car and noticed that I was nearly empty and I would have to make a stop for gas on my way home. I drove to the same gas station that I always used and pulled up to the pump. I then took the key out of the ignition and got out of the car. As the machine prompted me to do, I inserted my card and typed in my PIN number as usual. A few seconds went by before a message popped up on the screen that said my card had been denied. I was annoyed because I knew that my card definitely had money on it and was completely valid. I started the whole process over once more, and yet again I got a message saying that my card has been denied. I was definitely irritated. Now I was going to have to lock my car and go into the gas station to pay with cash. I knew I'd be waiting in a long line and it would take even longer for me to get home, but I knew I'd run out of gas if I didn't go in. I walked into the gas station after seeing how many people were in line, decided to walk around the store a bit in hopes of it later quieting down. I strolled through the aisles and ended up picking up some bottled lemonade. I was in the snack aisle trying to decide whether I wanted a bag of candy or some chips when I heard a low whistle. I turned to see it was from an older man standing close by me. He wore tattered clothing and a cowboy hat. The man looked me up and down before complimenting me on my dress and my appearance. I was taken aback by the compliment I hadn't been looking for and felt uncomfortable about the way the man's eyes were staring at my body. I was only a teenager at the time and suddenly felt as if the dress I had on was no longer covering as much skin as it should be. I simply turned away from the man without saying anything back to him and tried to focus on what I wanted to buy. The man didn't seem to get the hint. When I began to walk away, he followed me, this time asking what my name was and how old I was. I didn't answer and did my best to act like I didn't hear him. He was standing very close to me, and when he reached out a hand to tuck a free strand of my hair behind my ears, I felt absolutely livid. I told him I wasn't interested in continuing in conversation with him and that I wanted to be left alone. He laughed at my reaction. but eventually walked away. I was relieved and thought that I had finally gotten rid of the creeper. I grabbed my last item and walked up to the register to pay. After checking out, I walked out the automatic doors to head back to my car and pump the gas I had prepaid for. But shockingly, there was a white van blocking my path to the car. All 4 doors were open, and the man with the cowboy hat was standing right outside. I sprinted past him to my car and locked the doors just before he was able to catch up with me. I ended up driving straight home and reached the driveway just as I ran out of gas. My parents and I called the police, and they caught up with the man later that night. It turns out that he was wanted for a possible connection to a kidnapping in a nearby county. I grew up in a safe community where crime rarely occurred. My parents didn't worry much about anything bad happening to me in our area, so as long as I stayed in the neighborhood, I could ride my bike alone as much as I wanted. Their only request was that I got home before the streetlights went out. I always did as I was told, and there was never a problem. That was until one scary night in October. One of my friends' families was throwing a bonfire party in honor of Halloween, which was only a few days away. Anyone who wanted to come was invited, and it was expected to be a super fun event. The actual bonfire wasn't going to start until it was dark out, so I told my parents, and they told me it was fine if I came home that night. They knew my friend's parents really well and trusted that I would be completely safe. The party turned out to be so much fun. The adults were enjoying drinks while us younger folks were roasting marshmallows and making s'mores. We were all having such a good time that I was surprised to look down at my watch and notice that it was nearing midnight. I knew my parents would be waiting for me, so I decided it was time for me to be heading home. I said goodbye to everyone before hopping on my bike and speeding off towards home. I had only been on the bike for a few minutes when I heard a strange noise and my bike come to a sudden halt. I checked out my tire and realized it was completely flat. I was trying to decide what to do when all of a sudden I heard a voice that felt as if it came from nowhere. I looked up and saw an older man standing right next to me, a creepy grin on his face. He held a tire inflator in one hand and offered to help me out. I absolutely cherished my bike and felt terrible about leaving it behind, but there was something off about the man that made me not want to accept his help. Just as I was trying to decide what to do, the man reached out with his free hand and grabbed me, holding me tight from behind the neck. I frantically began kicking and screaming, just barely freeing myself from his grasp. I then took off running towards home on foot. I glanced back, but the man wasn't following me. After getting home, I told my parents what had happened, and they called 911. Unfortunately, they are still searching for the man. I never felt comfortable riding my bike alone in the neighborhood again after that. I was never a big fan of social media in high school. I had lots of friends in real life, and I was close to my family, so to be honest, I never felt the need for validation from the internet. But the story changed entirely in college. I left Oregon and went all the way to Texas to study fine arts. Suddenly, I had no friends or family close by, and I felt like an outsider in a huge town where everyone seemed to have a circle already. So, I turned to the online world, and unfortunately, I ended up regretting it deeply. During the fall semester, I got an Instagram account to keep in touch with my friends back home. Of course, we would do video calls every now and then, but we were all busy, so Instagram was the perfect way to see what they were up to on a daily basis. For a while, I didn't post much, just a picture from the college campus and a few others from around town. But one of my teachers saw my work during class, and she encouraged me to use social media to get my work out. You know, be my own manager. Most of my work is painting and collage, and the subject is always the human being. So my Instagram page was soon filled with portraits, nudes, and dancers. My teacher was right. My follower base increased tenfold in just weeks. But among 3,000 followers, there will always be some rotten apples. And what happened next is truly horrifying. I started noticing some strange comments below my posts. People asking to see this or that, or just insulting my work. One comment was especially strange. It was from an account called Little Do You Know, and it said, "You should be honest. I'm sure your body is not that perfect." He was commenting on a post of a painting, and the painting was showing a nude woman. But this wasn't me. It was a painting of a model we'd had in class. I really didn't know what to reply to this, and I was feeling a little worried and overwhelmed by the hatred. For a while, I thought I'd just ignore the nasty comments, and in the end, there was enough positive ones to still feel good about my Instagram page. But I just couldn't get that last comment out of my head. I wanted to make it clear that this was not my body, and that my Instagram page was an art one, not a selfie one. So the first time one of my colleagues, Elaine, invited me out, I dressed up nice and asked her to take a picture of me with the river in the background. Elaine was an aspiring artist herself, and she was very supportive of my social media accounts. So that evening, I posted the picture of myself on my page, captioning it something like, "I'm grateful to be in this town." I wanted to make sure Little Do You Know saw me. I don't know why, but I felt obsessed with fixing that comment. But that was a mistake, because 1 minute after posting my picture, the same account commented, "You're even uglier than I thought." I felt a knot in my stomach. I was angry and worried at the same time. Who was this person? What did they have against me? Now I knew he was a creepy stalker too, because he saw the post as soon as I uploaded it. A few days passed, and I didn't post anything new. I was wondering whether to cancel my account or to report his account, but I didn't want to give up that easily. It felt unfair that 2 comments could affect me so badly. I decided to push forward and confront the creep if he kept commenting. It turns out, that was a mistake too. Every time I posted an art piece, this person would insult me worse and worse. At one point he wrote, "I bet you're a real disappointment to your parents." He also wrote some horrible things about my mom, who didn't know anything about what I was going through at the time. And by now, it wasn't just him that was insulting me. He had created a little fan base who followed my account and made sure no post went without snide remarks. It was truly horrible. I felt angry and helpless, and the confidence sharing my art had given me was completely gone. For the next few days, I didn't post anything. I was considering my options again. Elaine was aware of what I was going through by now, and she was confident I should report the guy. But I felt too overwhelmed to do anything. It wasn't just him now. There were too many accounts to block and report, and I didn't feel like I could win this one. In fact, I was getting ready to simply delete my account and start afresh when I got a direct message. My heart stopped. It was Little Do You Know. He wrote, "Have you given up already?" He put a fire emoji in there too, to taunt me some more. I was boiling. I wrote back, "I don't know how your parents deal with you." Then, I suddenly felt afraid of what he would do next, so I decided it was time to follow Elaine's advice. I blocked him and reported him. Then I proceeded to delete all the negative comments from all my posts. It was hard work, but I was beginning to feel liberated. Like, maybe people will stop the hatred if the main evil disappeared. But it wasn't over yet. One night at around 3 a.m., I was fast asleep when I heard my phone vibrating. An unknown number was calling me. I don't normally answer to anyone, but I thought maybe someone in my family is having an emergency, and I didn't want to take any chances. I picked up, and a horrible, distorted voice said, "So you think you can just block a person out of your life?" I felt my throat dry and my hands frozen. It was this same creep who had ruined my Instagram page. I felt my voice trembling, but I had to answer something. "What do you want from me?" He let a sarcastic laugh out. Then he said, "I want you to admit you're nothing. With your little art and your little clothes, you think you're better than me, but you're not. You're nothing." I paused and thought for a moment. I could have taken this further, but if he had my phone number, surely he was able to learn my address too. That was the last thing I wanted. I decided to play his game and hope for the best. Fine, I'm nothing. Have a good night. I ended the call and tried to go back to bed, even if, to be honest, I couldn't even drop my eyelids that night. 6 months have passed since, and the creep hasn't contacted me again after that night. I have no idea what else he knows about me, and sometimes I lie awake at night just hoping he isn't somewhere near, stalking me. I tried talking to the police about it, but his account disappeared off the face of the earth, and they can't do much from one phone call. All I can do is hope that he found someone else to torture online, even though that's a very disturbing thought too. I must have been 9 or 10 when I first gained access to my mom's Snapchat. She saw I was super amused by the filters there and let me play with it every now and then. When she saw I knew how to use the app, she started letting me stay on her phone unsupervised. First, I thought it was awesome. I could play all the games and use all the filters on Snapchat whenever I wanted. But soon I got bored of just taking selfies and I wanted to share them with someone. None of my friends at the time had their own Snapchat accounts, and I wasn't going to chat with my mom's friends. So I created my own Snapchat account on my mom's phone, and every time I was done with it, I would log out and log back onto my mom's account, so she didn't suspect anything. I started simple by uploading funny selfies to my story. Soon, friend requests started appearing in my notifications. I didn't know any of these people personally, but most of them were kids like me, who wanted to exchange funny selfies and stickers. However, one of the friend requests I got was from a man called Ed. His profile picture was a Bitmoji of a boy, so it was impossible to tell his age. As soon as I accepted his friend request, he sent me a Bitmoji of himself holding a rose. I thought, okay, cool, I've made a new friend. I was very young and not very good at spotting red flags. So it was a long list of Bitmojis until I figured something was off. First of all, he was very insistent. Whenever he would see me online, he would shower me with funny stickers. I was intimidated by the number of messages and I felt obligated to respond. Then he started messaging me. "I want to see your face," he said in the first message. All I'd sent him so far were Bitmojis and reactions to his. I didn't realize his bad intentions, so I just took a selfie and added a dog filter to it. I sent it to him and said, "Your turn," but he didn't answer. In fact, he went offline, which was super unprecedented for him. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The next day when I picked up my mom's phone and logged into Snapchat again, there was nothing from him. But as soon as I came online, he messaged me again. "I want to see more of you. What do you look like as a whole?" By now, I knew this was strange. I thought about telling my mom, but I was sure she was going to scold me for setting up my own account and not telling her about it. So I decided to keep it secret. I didn't have the sharpest intuition then, but I knew I shouldn't send this man more pictures of myself. So I stopped chatting with him, but I would still use Snapchat to chat with my other friends. Ed didn't like this. He became angry and even more insistent, sending me messages like, "Why are you ignoring me?" Or, "You can't be too busy to talk to me. You're a child." These were worrying messages, and I barely slept anymore. One evening, I was just in the kitchen with my mom when we heard the doorbell. We weren't expecting anyone, so my mom looked at me confused, and I looked at her pretty scared. Mom went to the door and opened it just a bit, and I peeked from the kitchen. My heart stopped. It was Ed. I was sure. He looked just like his profile Bitmoji, except now I could see his real age. He was probably around 40 and creepy as hell. He had a calm smile on his face, like he was supposed to be there. How did he find me? Mom knew something was off, so she didn't hesitate. She asked him, "What the hell are you doing in my yard?" But he didn't flinch. He stayed strangely calm and said, "Hi, my name is Ed. I'm a friend of your daughter's, I think." I think by now Mom was piecing it together because she closed the door quickly and shouted at me to call the police. I took her phone and dialed 911 as fast as I could, and my mom locked the door. Ed was banging at the door with all his strength, and I was extremely scared and nauseous. I felt as stressed as guilty for keeping my mom out of this for so long. Mom and I just hugged and waited like that in the kitchen until the police came and arrested Ed. He is now in prison for cyberbullying several children. Only afterwards I found out that Snapchat has location services on unless you deactivate them. Ed could see where I was posting from all this time. It's a scary thought, knowing that there's so many children out there online unaware of this little feature. I just recommend staying in touch with your family if you're a kid and you've got a social media account. When I started high school, I was a small, dorky kid with no socializing skills. Usually when I got invited to a party, I would make some silly excuse and stay home to play video games. I lived with my dad, and he didn't have anything against my behavior. He had been a shy kid too, and he figured staying at home is safer than going to parties anyways. Well, he was about to find out the exact opposite was true. I had made a Steam account and was playing quite a lot of games such as Age of Empires and Red Dead Redemption. One of the games which I started playing obsessively was Don't Starve Together. It's a spooky survival game that you can play online with friends or strangers. As I said, back then, I wasn't exactly the friendly type, but that didn't mean I didn't want to have friends. I just didn't know how to approach them. So I was hoping to make friends out of strangers that played the same game as me. So for a few nights in a row, I played Don't Starve together by joining random groups and doing my best to be a valuable team member. In the chat, I would get small comments addressed to me like, "Be more careful about the tall bird," or "Can you gather some more wood before nightfall?" These people were only interested in playing, and I didn't know how to approach them without scaring them off. Finally, someone approached me, a user called Liam. He said, "I like your gaming style. You're quite laid back." I liked the compliment and the fact that he noticed that about me. I said, "Thanks. I mostly like exploring the island and collecting stuff, more than fighting or competing for stats." We then continued to chat as we played, and we even chatted outside the game once the round finished. He seemed like a friendly guy who was just as passionate about the game as I was. To 15-year-old me, this sounded like a great base for a friendship. Over the next few days, we would only join games together so that we could chat on the side. Then he suggested playing just the two of us in a local game. The plan actually worked for me because a 2-player game is less competitive and more based on exploration. However, this also means that you depend on talking to one another for planning. So it wasn't long before Liam suggested that we speak on the phone while we played. The first phone call was pretty nice. He kept complimenting my skills, and he asked me about myself. I told him I was a high school student and that I didn't have many friends, and that I lived with my dad. I found it a bit weird when he didn't want to give me his age. When I asked him how old he was, he just said, "Older than you." But I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe he was embarrassed he was playing Don't Starve together at his age. But that was nothing compared to our next conversations. With every phone call, he was a little more hostile. First, he commented on a mistake I made within the game. "I can't believe you let him destroy our camp. It would have been so easy to hold the fort." I felt attacked, but mostly guilty, and I said, "Sorry, I'll be more careful." Then the insults started. Suddenly, I wasn't doing anything right. He would raise his tone and call me an idiot every time he wouldn't get the desired outcome. I really didn't like this, and I started telling him, "I don't like your attitude." I told him at one point, but he wouldn't back off. "Well, my attitude would be much nicer if you weren't messing it up every minute." This really didn't feel fair, and I was getting worried and just brought down by this so-called friendship. I decided to stop talking to him. But my decision meant nothing to him. In fact, he was only angered by my decision. So one late evening, I was just brushing my teeth when I heard I got a notification on my phone. It was a voice message from Liam. I knew it couldn't be a nice one, but I had to listen to it. He had a really low, scary voice. He said, "I don't know how you can live with yourself. You're an ugly little kid with no friends and no mom. And when a friend appears in your life, you shun him? You ungrateful idiot." I felt my hands turn ice cold as I listened to this dreadful message. My head hurt, and I just wanted to disappear. Everything he said was true. I really did feel ugly, and I really was lonely, and my mom had left me and my dad a few years back. I didn't respond to Liam, and I spent the next night feeling anxious about myself. The next day, I didn't even speak to Dad. I felt horrible about myself and I didn't want to be alive anymore. My dad was worried. He asked me if I was okay, but I just mumbled something about being tired and crawled back to play something on Steam. I was in the middle of a game when I got another voice message from Liam. By now, I felt hooked to this self-destructive relationship. The message encouraged me to take my own life, as I probably didn't have much to live for anyway. This message felt like a weight off my chest. Like finally I had the solution to my self-loathing. In my desperation, I almost felt like Liam was right. This was what I had to do. So I stood up and walked to the bathroom. My dad must have seen my pale, zombie-like face because he asked me from the living room, "Son, are you okay?" I said nothing and locked myself in the bathroom. I looked in the mirror for minutes straight, contemplating what I was about to do. I was feeling dizzy and almost like I was outside of my body. Meanwhile, my dad realized I had been in the bathroom for too long, so he came to the door and started knocking. He was calling my name and wanted me to come out, saying he wanted to talk to me about something urgent. His voice was stressing me out. I just wanted to get this over with. I rushed to get a razor blade from the shelves under the sink, and I dropped a few things on the sink. My hands were trembling. I picked up the razor blade inside, and just then, my dad kicked the door in. My dad was livid for days straight after this. He couldn't believe he didn't see my state or prevent my horrible friendship with Liam. I wasn't too well either. I felt manipulated and disappointed in myself for letting a stranger get to me like that. We spoke to the police about this person, and they traced his IP address and had him arrested a few days back. He is being investigated for multiple cases of cyberbullying. Ever since the incident, Dad encouraged me to get out of the house and make real friends with real faces and a normal age. Now I am a very different person to who I was back then. I am much more confident, and I know now that no one has the right to talk to me like that. But I still worry about all the internet predators out there, knowing that there are many vulnerable teens online. When I was in college, I was attending a university in Washington, just a couple of hours away from my hometown. I was studying to be an English teacher, and my boyfriend Charlie was an environmental science major. Charlie had a project coming up that required him to gather rock and soil samples and would write a report on them. To do this, he was planning a weekend camping trip in a forest not far from our campus. His buddy Jake from his class was going to be coming along. When Charlie asked me to join him and Jake, I was completely against the idea of it at first. It was November, so it was pretty chilly out, and it was always raining in Washington. But I could see how much this meant to Charlie and how much he wanted me to go. He was always supportive of me and all of my studies, and I wanted to do the same for him. So I told him I would go. When I tell you a camping trip is probably the worst activity I can imagine doing over a weekend, I mean it. I have always hated it with such a passion. I can't stand the bugs, the mud, or the fact that there are no restrooms. Plus, we would be out in the middle of nowhere where we would have literally no cell service. To say I'm addicted to my phone is putting it lightly, so this was going to be tough for me. Of course, I didn't tell any of this to Charlie. He was so happy gathering up all the supplies we were going to need for the trip. As we walked through the local sports and supplies store to pick out a tent and outdoor cooking supplies, he had a huge smile on his face. He was rambling on and on and on about different types of soil and samples of things he was hoping to find during our trip. I nodded along and tried to seem like I was as excited as he was. He was truly the best boyfriend who would do anything for me at the drop of a hat. I thought about the countless nights he spent helping me make flashcards for one of my upcoming tests instead of watching football with his friends, or there were times he woke up extra early to get me a Starbucks coffee and bring it to me at my dorm before class. A couple of days getting rained on in the woods was the least I could do for him. The plan was to leave after we finished classes on Friday afternoon. We would spend Friday and Saturday night in the woods and get back home on Sunday. I was absolutely dreading this. I put on old clothes, ones that I didn't care if they got dirty, and strapped on a pair of hiking boots that Charlie bought me. We gathered our things up and then got into Charlie's Jeep to pick up Jake. As we drove through the forest, the guys chatted excitedly about the trip while I sat in silence. Eventually, we reached the parking lot at the edge of the forest. There were no other cars there, which was not a surprise to me. Who wanted to go hiking in this weather? It had been drizzling all day. We got out of the car, strapped on our backpacks, and began making our way through the woods. Since once we got deeper into the woods, we wouldn't be able to use the GPS on our phones, Charlie was relying on a paper map. Occasionally, he would hand it to Jake, who would double-check that we were going in the right direction. The woods were thick, and with the gray sky overhead, it was pretty dark. It felt like we had been walking for hours, and I was sure I had blisters on both of my feet. The boys, who had been chatting excitedly at first, were now more quiet. There was a certain spot in the woods where we were planning to set up camp. Once we got there, it would be a short walking distance away from a small lake. The boys would be able to get all the rock and soil samples they would need there. I could tell it was taking us longer to get there than the boys had expected. They were arguing a little, something that was completely unlike them. Jake kept saying we were going in the wrong direction, but Charlie insisted he knew where we were. I could tell it was getting late because it was even harder to see where we were going. It had gotten so dark. At last, Charlie let out a loud groan. We need to pitch a tent now and call it a night. If we wait any longer, it'll be too dark. We just have to try again in the morning. Charlie got the tent set up while Jake started a fire so we could have some dinner. Our dinner was a can of beans each, and my stomach was still grumbling when I was finished, but I kept quiet. We decided to go to bed early that night. We all slept in the same clothes we had been wearing and let the fire burn outside of our tent to try and make the cold more manageable. I curled myself up against Charlie in my sleeping bag and held on to him for body heat, but it didn't make the cold any less miserable. Right when I thought I had almost managed to get to sleep, I heard a strange screaming sound that sounded far away. It caused me to sit up straight. "What's wrong?" Charlie murmured, clearly still only half awake. "Jake, where's Jake?" Charlie sat up and looked around the tent. He seemed surprised to notice that Jake's sleeping bag was empty. "Jake?" He crawled to the entrance of the tent, unzipped it, and then called out Jake's name again. The sound that followed was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard in my life. It was Jake's voice, but he was screaming like he was being tortured. I could only identify one of the words that he was screaming, and it was help. I put my hands over my ears because I couldn't stand another second of the screaming. "Stay here," Charlie hissed at me as he climbed out of the tent, as if I could even dream of leaving what little safety I had left. I climbed as far down into my sleeping bag as I could and tried to pretend that I was invisible. It felt like hours before Charlie came back to the tent. Tears were staining his cheeks, and he was cut up, scratches covering his face. I crawled over to him, my heart beating faster than I had ever thought possible. "Are you okay?" He looked stunned and was unable to speak at first. I couldn't find him. I could hear him screaming and I kept running towards his voice, but then he went quiet. I couldn't see anything and I kept running into things. I grabbed his hand to try and make him feel better. We tried to piece together what could have happened. Jake must have woken up and had to go to the bathroom, so he left the tent. Something must have gotten him, a bear, a mountain lion, something. He was either dead or laying around severely injured now. I was shaking. I was so scared, and all I wanted to do was get out of these woods and go home. Whenever we reached self-service, we would be able to call 911. Maybe there would still be hope for Jake. But Charlie insisted that we couldn't go anywhere until the daylight. It would be too hard to get out of the woods in the dark, and whatever had attacked Jake was still out there. The rest of the night was absolutely miserable. All we could do was huddle together, listen to the sound of the rain pouring on our tent, and hope that whatever predator was out there wasn't coming for us next. Sleep was no longer a possibility. It felt like ages before the light finally began to come into our tent. It was finally morning. Charlie was organizing our things so that we would be ready to go as soon as possible. All of a sudden, I heard him gasp, and I turned to see what was wrong. "The map," he said in a panicked voice. "Jake must have taken the map with him because it's not here." Charlie was pacing around the tent while I sat on the ground and tried to avoid having a panic attack. Finally, he seemed to calm down. He told me he thought he could find the way. He studied the map before we left, and he remembered most of it. Feeling slightly more hopeful, we climbed out of the tent and got ready to go. I was the first one out of the tent, so I saw it first. It was the most horrible sight I had ever seen. It was Jake. I could tell by the clothes, even though a bag had been placed over his head. He had been tied up high in the trees with ropes. His clothes were tattered and covered in blood. I knew this was not the work of an animal, but something much darker. Charlie grabbed my arm and began pulling me forward. I could tell he was in a state of shock because he didn't cry. "We need to go now." We left the tent behind, only bothering to carry our backpacks. Charlie would have me continuously check my phone to see if I could get any service, but I would only do so every 30 minutes or so in hopes of making my battery last as long as possible. Every time I checked, there was still no service. I had no idea if we were going the right way or not. I just had to trust that Charlie knew what he was doing. We had been walking for several hours when all of a sudden there was a horrific howl coming from somewhere in the woods behind us. It didn't sound like an animal, but like something more demonic. It took everything in me not to scream. We took off running as fast as we could, the howls getting louder and louder. Whatever it was getting closer to us. Charlie urged me to keep running. At one point, I looked over my shoulder and saw a creature that looked like it belonged in a nightmare. It looked like a giant gorilla standing at least 10 feet tall. It had fangs instead of teeth. In its hand was Jake's baseball cap. I screamed at the top of my lungs and began running even faster. At last, there was a clearing, and to my amazement, I saw Charlie's Jeep parked right where we had left it. I immediately dialed 911. When we got back to town, we spent hours talking to detectives and park rangers about what we had experienced. Rangers combed the forest and were able to retrieve Jake's body, but could find no sign of the creature that killed him. To this day, the creature still roams the woods free. Every night, I hear his tortured screams in my dreams. When I was in high school, there was this kid named Ricky. Ricky was the outsider of our grade. He had acne, was obsessed with anime, and simply didn't even try to fit in. Kids were mean to him, and I mean really mean. They would write terrible notes on his locker, put thumbtacks on his seat, and mess with his lunch when he wasn't looking. He didn't do anything to fight back. I felt terrible for him, and went out of my way to try and be as nice as possible to him. There was a tradition at our school that the seniors would take part in every year. A few weeks before graduation, everyone would have a campout outside the school. We would roast hot dogs and make s'mores. There were always a few kids that would sneak some booze in. It was a great way to bond with everyone one last time before we all went our separate ways in college. On the Friday of the campout, Ricky sat down in his usual seat next to me in history class. I tried to make polite small talk with him. "You going to the campout tonight?" I asked him, figuring the answer was probably no. Ricky had a strange look on his face.
"I might show up later,"
he muttered. "You should, it's gonna be fun," I encouraged him. He just stared at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read. That night at the campout, I was gathered around a campfire with some of my close girlfriends. I was glancing around looking to see if I could spot Ricky, but he was nowhere in sight. I felt a little disappointed. It was yet another high school memory he was missing out on. Before long, it got late, and my friends and I decided to call it a night. All three of us would be sleeping in the same tent. There were still a few groups of people hanging out and laughing, so I decided to put some earplugs in so I could block out the noise. It took me a while to adjust to sleeping on the ground, but eventually I drifted off to sleep. I was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. I yanked the earplugs out of my ears and grabbed my phone, using it to light up the tent. My friends all looked terrified. "What the heck is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Maybe some guys are playing a prank on the girls," one of my friends said, but I didn't think this was right. I could tell the screams were screams of terror. "I'm going out there to figure out what's going on," but my friends grabbed onto me tightly, not letting me go. The screams were getting louder and they were getting closer to us. "I'm calling 911, my friend muttered, grabbing her phone. Suddenly, the entrance to our tent was unzipped, causing all three of us to scream. I recognized the person immediately. It was a girl named Jillian. She was from my math class. There was blood splattered across her face and her blonde hair sticking out all over. "Jillian, what happened?" "It's Ricky," she sobbed. "He's got a gun and he shot everyone in my tent. I think they're dead. I don't know why he didn't shoot me." My heart was thudding in my chest. How could this be true? Had Ricky finally snapped? "We need to make a run for it," I said. "No," Jillian hissed. "He'll shoot us the second we do." The zipper of our tent was ripped only a few seconds later. We all huddled together, shaking. Ricky stood at the entrance of our tent, but he didn't look like Ricky anymore. There was blood covering his clothing, ammo strapped to his chest, and he had a crazed look on his face. I reached my arms out to protect my friends, adrenaline running through my veins. "Please, Ricky," I begged. "Don't do this. Remember who you are." Ricky hesitated for a moment before calling out my name in a shaking voice.
"Maria? Is that you?"
"Yes, it's me. Please don't hurt us. This isn't who you are." Trying to make my voice sound as calm as possible. Suddenly, I heard sniffling, and I realized I was crying. I decided to try one more time to get through to him. "Please, Ricky, put the gun down." Ricky hesitated a moment before finally, outstretching his hand and handing me the loaded weapon. I thanked him and took it from him. The next thing I knew, he had taken off running into the night. Jillian burst into tears beside me. My friend was still on the phone with 911, who told us to stay in our tents until help arrived. Much to my relief, the sound of police sirens filled the air a few moments later. The officer's eyes filled with shock as he saw the gun laying on the floor of our tent. He told us to all put our hands in the air and make our way into the school, where we would wait until we were considered safe to leave. We did as we were told. I could hardly believe the carnage that was all around us as soon as we left the tent. Lifeless bodies were laying on the ground, and people were being loaded up into stretchers. They found Ricky a short time later, and he confessed to everything. 7 people had been killed during his bloody rampage. It seemed that he had been targeting the people who had made fun of him the last 4 years. I know what Ricky did was wrong and terrible, and I feel awful for the families of the kids who died. But somehow, I also find myself feeling bad for Ricky too. He was bullied for years, and now will spend the rest of his life in a jail cell. I knew in my heart that this was something that could have been prevented. I'm grateful every day that he allowed me to live another day. When I was a little kid, my elementary school playground bordered a forest. Going into the forest was very much against the rules, and everyone was told that they needed to always stay where a teacher could see them. Of course, there were a lot of kids, and the teachers couldn't always keep their eyes on everyone all of the time. Every recess, there were at least a couple kids that would venture out into the woods. The forest was considered a place of adventure, and the further you could get in without being caught, the cooler you were. I was about 12 years old at the time, and I was very much a teacher's pet. I didn't do anything to get in trouble and always stayed on top of my schoolwork. That was until I met Chris, a kid who was also in the 4th grade like me, but in a different class. Chris was an extremely talented artist who would pass me little handmade items whenever we passed each other in the hallway. Sometimes it was an origami crane, and other times it was a drawing or a handwritten letter. I had the biggest crush on him. On one particular day, Chris passed me in between classes and told me that my surprise was hidden in the tallest oak tree, just inside the forest. I was immediately nervous. I knew how much trouble I could get in if I was caught going into the forest, but I also knew how much I was desperate to see what Chris had left me. During recess that day, I took a look around, and the second that I knew all the teachers had their backs turned, I raced into the forest at full speed. I knew just the tree Chris had been talking about. It was way taller than any of the other trees near the outskirts of the forest. I found it without any problems and quickly saw what Chris had left me. It was a tiny, hand-painted Christmas ornament of an angel hanging from one of the lower branches. I smiled and reached out to grab it when all of a sudden, I felt a set of strong hands gripping my waist. I immediately went into panic mode and began fighting and kicking as hard as I could. When I looked over my shoulder, I could see my attacker. It was a middle-aged man. He was dressed strangely. He was wearing a wolf costume, like the kind you would get for Halloween, even though it was nowhere near Halloween. When I realized I was much too weak to fight him off, I did the only thing I could think of. I sunk my teeth right into his arm. I knew I had hurt him badly when I felt his blood fill my mouth. The bite caused him to release me, and I took off running back towards my school. The second I got to a teacher, I explained what happened, and the police were called immediately. When they arrived at my school, they told me I was a very lucky girl, and that if I hadn't fought as hard as I could, I would have likely ended up dead in some shallow grave in the woods. Never again did I enter those woods without an adult. If you liked this video, check out the other recent videos on Anna Horror, and sleep.
God, I can't even keep my eyes still, Adrian said, beaming at the prospect of utter carnage ahead. My eyes ended up drifting toward the dancing guy, who was jubilantly performing the shuffle along the second-floor walkway. Soon enough, he crossed paths with Nassar, who was grinning like a madman. Without much hesitation, he stepped forward, heading right towards the dancer. "Well, I guess it's over for him," I said. I had yet to hear about anybody being able to inflict any kind of damage against the dancing guy. The only thing we could really do was contain him, and I severely doubted that things were going to be any different here. "I'm not so sure," Adrian responded. The guy's a wild card. I think he's just testing the waters here. Before I knew it, Nassar had gotten dangerously close. I held my breath in anticipation. There's no way, I thought. And I was right. Nassar tried to strike the dancer but was blitzed immediately. I could hardly comprehend what had even happened. One moment, he was in the midst of throwing a right cross, and the next, he was planted firmly within the concrete wall, missing an arm and with a gaping hole in his chest.
Holy shit!
He spurted out. He looked towards the dancer, still inexplicably grinning.
Damn, you're strong.
What the hell's wrong with him? I wondered out loud. Nothing at all, Adrian answered. I think I've found a kindred spirit. Nassar pulled himself out of the crater he'd made, displaying zero indication that he was in any kind of pain at all. Suddenly, a flurry of glass engulfed his chest wound and missing arm, reverting them back to normal in a matter of seconds. He stretched himself out before nodding happily at the dancer and walking off. What the fuck? I thought. I looked over at Sandu, wanting to see his own reaction, but he was stone-like, staring at only one monitor in particular. I followed his eyes and realized that for whatever reason, he was focused on the kid who was still sitting in his cell. Oh, check it out. My thoughts were broken by Adrian's outburst. She's found her prey. I looked at the monitor he was gesturing to, seeing Kale and Hugo being hacked away at by Callista.
Now who the hell is she?
Kale shouted, taking a sequence of gnarly gashes to the chest.
Evil incarnate.
Hugo answered. Although still severely injured, he was able to move around on his own.
Look at her eyes. She's being controlled by the devil.
Callista drilled her hand forward, impaling Kale through the solar plexus. He chopped at her arm before pushing her off.
Fucking hell.
He sighed.
This is back-breaking work.
Are you a match for her?
Hugo asked. Kale shook his head, exhausted as hell.
Doubt it.
In that case,
Hugo said, standing up.
it seems I'll have to detach myself fully.
What the hell are you talking about?
My constraints were only lifted halfway last time.
You almost died last time. Are you sure you're gonna make it out this time?
I'm not planning to.
Kale chuckled.
Sorry, but I'm not gonna let you do that.
Hugo's eyes began glowing a familiar crimson.
I've been ordained a holy mission. I'll do whatever it takes.
He stared at the rapidly approaching Callista.
Anything to eliminate evil.
His scars began glowing again, brighter than ever this time, preparing to engulf the oncoming enemy. But before they could clash, Kale stepped in between and tanked another series of slashes before kicking her back. He grunted.
Fuck, that hurt.
What are you doing?
Hugo asked, perplexed.
I told you, this is...
Yeah, you're God-given whatever the fuck. I don't know, buddy. You're psycho. But for whatever reason, I don't really want you to die.
Kale gave him a bloody grin.
It feels like we've been through a lot, you know?
For a moment, it seemed as if Hugo was at a loss for words. But then Callista stood back up.
I see.
He said.
But what are we going to do about her?
Kale looked down and sighed.
Shit. Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it?
Kale clenched his teeth as Callista began charging at them once again. It looks like Lady Luck's on their side today, Adrian said. I realized what he meant when one of Callista's hands were bitten straight off by the chattering man who'd strolled into the fray from an adjacent corridor.
Well, shit.
Kale said, watching the two suddenly preoccupied with each other.
Looks like God is looking out for us.
He grinned at Hugo, who simply nodded back as the two got the fuck out of Dodge. Callista and the chattering man began relentlessly butchering each other. Using her remaining hand, she made 2 quick slashes in succession, tearing open his chest and forehead. In response, the chatterer bit a good portion of her shoulder off. This went on for a few minutes, until about half of Callista's body remained and about 90% of the chattering man's skin had been shredded off, staining the entire area a gory red. But even demonic superhumans had their limit, and they both were beginning to slow down. Callista twisted her bloody, knife-like fingers, pushing them into the chattering man's mouth and through his throat. While it was still lodged inside, she threw her arm upwards, splitting his head apart. But at the exact same time, the chattering man swiped at her head, twisting her neck clean off. They both fell simultaneously, as combatants who fought to the bloody end. It was by far the most brutal bout I'd seen thus far, although there was certainly some fierce competition for that title. I decided to check back on the voids that were still contained. The Titan was still in his cell. The Calamity's light also remained green, and the kid hadn't stepped out either. But then there was the Warden. Clint had stepped into his cell, donning the behemoth suit in all of its destructive glory. Wearing it brought them roughly up to the same size. Still, he was just an ordinary guy going up against an unfairly powerful monster. Unless he had some tricks up his sleeve, this was about to get really messy really quick.
Hey,
He said, grinning at the warden through his fortified visor.
you've been chasing me all this time. Thought I'd finally come to you instead.
It sounds like they have unfinished business, Adrian said. That much was probably true. Still staring down at the blood-stained floor, the warden simply let out a deep, lengthy sigh. When he finally looked up, there was nothing in his pit-like eyes but sheer rage.
Your death won't be quick.
His voice was much deeper than the Marianas. Before Clint could even get his guard up, he was brutally blitzed by a sudden rush. The warden was moving so fast, he was effectively a blur. Clint was launched backwards, denting a metal wall. The warden bolted at him again, slashing off pieces of his suit with nothing but his fingers. He launched his fist at Clint's protective visor, smashing it to bits and cutting up his face with bits of stray glass in the process. However, Clint managed to push him off before it could connect with his skull, which would have been beyond fatal.
Fuck!
He spat, attempting to unsheath the oversized blade at his side, but he wasn't nearly quick enough. The warden grabbed it by the edge before Clint could even swing, shattering it to fine dust with nothing but a firm grasp. Then he grabbed the suit by the arm, slamming Clint hard into the ground, causing him to spit out blood. Shit, Adrian muttered. This is even hard for me to watch. The warden proceeded to uncompromisingly wail away on top of him, while Clint barely managed to protect his face with the suit's wrist guards, but even those were being chipped away at rather quickly. Just as there was about an inch of the suit left covering his arms, he tilted his elbows towards the warden's neck, firing off a small grenade that caused the overpowered Void to stagger just a little. The warden retreated, touching the small wound that the explosion had left under his chin. In turn, Clint struggled to pull himself up, with his suit looking like it had been run over by about a dozen freight trains. His face was covered in blood and cuts, while a blood vessel had popped in his right eye. Yet he shot the warden a gory smirk.
Okay, maybe I deserved that, but the comeback starts now.
He opened a compartment on his suit's ribcage, taking out something that resembled a small white crystal.
Remember these?
He asked before using it to cut himself on an exposed portion of his wrist. The warden's face twisted into an unfathomable expression of fury. He rushed forward again, tackling Clint into another wall, before ripping off a large chunk of the suit's torso, and then he drilled his fist into Clint's ribcage. At that moment, I was 100% sure that he was done for, but to my downright surprise, he managed to tank the punch, grimacing only slightly. "What do you think?" he asked the warden, still grinning. "We ran some experiments. These shards are new and improved." The warden let out an ear-splitting shriek that I was surprised didn't deafen Clint on the spot. Before picking him up and tossing him back into the cell, he followed him in, picking his head up and bashing his temple about 10 times into the metal toilet seat before I ended up breaking from the force. As a result, one side of Clint's face was beginning to resemble a bloody mush. Still, I was surprised it hadn't been reduced to pulp. What the hell was that shard? I thought to myself. He also seemed to have picked up a bounce in his step, evading another strike from the warden and crawling behind him. At that point, the behemoth had effectively been reduced to scrap metal. Clint dove towards the god-slaying cannon, which had been knocked loose during their scuffle. He scooped it up and began spraying at the warden's direction. However, he managed to evade just about every shot, leaving large clouds of smoke and dust behind him as the devastating bullets reduced the place to rubble.
Fuck, you're a tough customer.
Clint groaned as he flipped a switch on the weapon.
Take this then.
The barrel of the weapon suddenly grew in size, causing it to resemble an actual cannon. As he pulled the trigger, the monitor darkened for just a moment before a flash of deep red engulfed the area, and a high-pitched staccato of wholly unfamiliar noises assaulted my senses. I kept watching as the recoil from the strange blast pushed Clint back into the wall as it completely annihilated the entire side of the room. The weapon itself was also destroyed in the process. I guess the god-slaying cannon got an upgrade, because I sure as hell didn't know it could do that. After the smoke cleared, everything was silent for a few moments. Clint grinned, letting out a big sigh of relief, and then his face dropped a few seconds later. As the rubble began stirring, the warden burst out, with about half of his entire body now charred to hell. He also had a wicked, psychotic grin on his face. It was the first time I'd ever seen him make any kind of overt expression at all. I could have lived without it, though.
You took everything from me.
he said, walking ominously towards the nearly broken Clint.
But I have to admit, this has been a hell of a fun time.
Son of a bitch!
Clint groaned, reaching into his pant leg pocket. He pulled out 2 syringes filled with black and blue liquids respectively.
Come on, painkillers, don't let me down!
He muttered before injecting the blue. Just as he was about to inject the black, the warden clutched his hand, crushing it along with the syringe.
More tricks.
He sneered, his eyes wild as all hell.
I guess that's what the weak resort to.
Clint simply laughed.
You're not so smart when you're angry, huh? It's in my blood now.
The warden released the grip, revealing Clint's bloody, cut up, and mangled hand. However, the black substance was already seeping into his wound.
What is that?
The warden asked.
A gift from a good friend. Also my last resort. I didn't want to use it now, but I guess I'm out of options.
In a matter of seconds, nearly all of Clint's wounds had healed up. Along with that, his muscles had become visibly tensed.
That's impossible.
The warden gritted his teeth.
That's one thing I've learned.
Clint responded, smiling wide as he stepped forward. Nothing's really impossible. He stepped forward, throwing a hard strike at the warden's chest, sending him crashing back into the rubble. Clint looked down at his fist in surprise.
Nice.
He grinned, but he had no time to appreciate his newfound power. The warden rose back up like a wild animal in frenetic pursuit of its prey.
You're weak.
He boomed.
I'll never lose to you. Nature won't allow it.
Clint chuckled.
You're right. I am weak. Must suck for your ego, huh?
The warden shrieked before charging back at Clint. Once there, they engaged in a fiery exchange of blows, rocking the place to its core. While Clint's physical attributes had been enhanced greatly by whatever serum he'd taken, there was still an evident gap in strength between them, with each of the warden's blows ostensibly packing more force than his own. However, he did have one advantage. He was clearly trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat, while the warden was an amateur at best. He dodged a series of haymakers before countering with a flurry of jabs and kicks of his own. At that point, the warden's mannerisms had devolved into that of a feral creature's, fueled solely by combative impulse. Yet I could see the same wicked grin creeping in throughout his wild rage. He was undoubtedly enjoying the adrenaline. The warden picked Clint up by the waist, slamming him into the wall and then onto the ground, and then he mounted him, unleashing a series of hammer fists that Clint was forced to excruciatingly block with his forearms. Soon enough, his skin was beginning to tear off from the punishment. While on the ground, Clint managed to throw a kick that connected with the warden's hip. However, he hardly got any reaction out of him. He suddenly wasn't strong enough. Instead, the warden threw both his fists down onto Clint's ribs, and I could hear them crack through the monitor. He grimaced in pain, but the warden didn't give him a moment to recuperate. He drilled a fist right into the side of his face. A spurt of blood and a few teeth flew out of his mouth as his head was cranked to the side. "Oh, he's gotta be fucking done for," Adrian commented. I had to share the sentiment. Clint's efforts were more than admirable, but he sure as hell put up a better fight than I could have ever hoped to. But even with all his tools, tricks, and skills, he was still no match. At least that's what I genuinely believed, but the guy was just full of surprises. After taking another brutal strike to the shoulder, Clint managed to somehow escape out from underneath. I couldn't even fathom what kind of move he pulled in order to do so. And then, in a series of moves that would make most prolific jiu-jitsu practitioners light up with glee, he engaged the warden in a vicious grappling match on the ground. From his face, I could tell that he was going far above and beyond his own limits. It was down there where the warden's weakness really became clear as day. He had no idea what to do. After an entire minute of relentless, excruciating struggle from both combatants, Clint managed to get the warden into a beautiful Darce choke. As the warden struggled feverishly to escape, Clint's face was wrought with sheer determination. The warden changed his tactics, opting to pound Clint's already broken ribs in an attempt to cause him to break his hold. That was a bad decision. It only allowed Clint to get his hold even tighter. Despite all of the egregious punishment he'd taken, Clint never relented. Soon enough, the warden's movements began slowing, and then he stopped altogether. Even then, Clint didn't release his grip. He held the warden's neck in place using all of his strength for about 4 minutes before finally letting go, all while gasping in accumulated pain and exhaustion. The guy really looked as if he was going to die on the spot, but that didn't matter to him. The fight was finished and an unlikely victor had emerged. With a tired grin on his face, he raised a shaky fist in victory before passing out himself. "Well, I'm fucking touched," Adrian said. "It's like watching Rocky all over again." On another monitor, Bella made her way back to the top floor, back to the gaping exit.
Wow, what a pleasant surprise.
Ken said, standing in her way. She seemed to share the surprise as they stared at each other.
Is this a joke?
She responded. Ken shrugged. Where else was I gonna see you?
Are you going to let me go?
Well, if I did that, then American Boy would track me down and kick my ass. I gotta wait till he dies first. Then we can go off into the sun together.
He smiled.
In the meantime, you want to talk for a bit?
She sighed.
What do you think is going on here?
Well, I don't know.
Ken responded.
That's up to you. You already know how I feel.
I tried to assassinate you.
You were contracted to assassinate me by a massive dickhead. I'm sure it was nothing personal.
Oh my god.
She sighed again.
Besides, I'm still alive. Maybe you really didn't want to kill me. That's what I tell myself anyway.
You're insane if you think anything's going to happen between us. You think I want to date anybody right now?
Well, I never wanted to either, until I met you.
A period of silence followed.
Let's face it,
Ken spoke up.
we're bad people living bad lives. Don't you get tired of it?
Speak for yourself.
Bella responded.
You know what kind of people I kill.
I'm not talking about that. You want to escape, don't you?
I don't belong in here.
A lot of people don't.
What are you getting at?
I'm pretty sure you know the kid.
Yeah, what about him?
Ken exhaled.
Look, forget about dating, but don't you ever feel like doing something good for once? Like doing something for somebody besides yourself?
Bella simply rolled her eyes in response.
I'm sorry, that came out badly.
She stepped forward, brushing past him.
I'm leaving now. If you want to try and stop me, then go ahead. I'll just kick your ass again.
There was another pause before Ken shook his head.
You know I'm not going to do that.
Good.
She began walking off.
I'm not tired of anything, by the way. I'm in control of my own life, and I kind of enjoy that.
She said without turning around. She left Ken looking somewhat melancholic, but eventually he began smiling again.
Of course you do.
He took off, abandoning his post, but I'm sure he hardly cared about that. Geez, well, that was a downer, Adrian said. Let's get back to the exciting stuff. He grinned. The final chips are starting to fall into place. Jack had finally found Wu.
You a Chinese secret weapon or something?
He asked, approaching the mechanical menace, who remained silent.
It doesn't matter.
He continued, clenching his fists. America's always on top. Look up there as well. I turned to the monitor that Adrian was gesturing towards, watching as Kente continued roaming the corridors, still clenching his teeth in justice-driven rage. Well, actually, no, he wasn't roaming anymore. He was walking towards somebody. But at first, I couldn't recognize who it was.
Come at me, you fucking asshole!
But I did recognize the voice. It was Senju. His head was now resembling a glowing, floating skull shrouded in a dark haze. Didn't he die? I asked, confused. Adrian chuckled. Don't you know anything about the Wraith style? One of its core proponents is the revival technique. Of course, I thought. How could I not know that?
You killed everyone at my fucking dojo!
Senju screamed at the approaching Kente.
You're dead!
Kente bit down even harder, cracking his own teeth.
I simply enacted justice. And I waited for too long to finish the job.
Man, how lucky were we to find this place? Adrian